My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 33, and I balanced $11 million in trust assets every quarter without a single audit flag for 6 years straight. That's not a brag. It's just a fact I kept in my back pocket, the way other people keep a driver's license. Proof I existed. Proof I was good at something, even if nobody at that table would ever ask me about it. The restaurant was called Averline, the kind of place with candlelight that made everyone look forgiving. White tablecloths ironed so hard. They held a crease down the middle like a spine. I'd booked the private room 3 weeks in advance, 6 places. My name at the head of the table, because it was my birthday. And because for one night a year, I let myself believe that mattered. I'd walked through the room, in daylight 2 weeks earlier, run my palm along the back of the chair where my mother would sit, chosen the wine myself, so no one else could overrule me. It's a strange kind of hope, setting a table for people you already half suspect won't fill it. I did it anyway. I always did it anyway. I got there at 6:45. Reservation was for 7. By 7:20, the bread basket had gone cold and the butter had started to sweat in its little dish. I want you to picture the specific kind of stillness in a room, set for 6 people that only has one person sitting in it. The waiter kept refilling my water without making eye contact, which is its own kind of mercy. Somewhere behind me, another table was laughing about somebody's anniversary, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that laughter has a temperature. And I was sitting 3 degrees outside of it. I checked my phone every few minutes, though I tried not to look like I was checking. At 7:35, I told the waiter my party might be caught in traffic. He nodded, the way people nod when they already suspect otherwise, and topped off my water without a word. By 7:45, the candle on the small cake I'd ordered, vanilla, my grandmother's favorite, because some part of me liked pretending she was still at the table, had melted into a shallow pool of wax across the frosting. I never lit it. There didn't seem to be much point in lighting something with no one there to watch it burn. At 7:52, my phone lit up, not a call. A text from my mother, Patricia Livy. We talked about it, and we think we all just need some space this year. Let's skip the birthday thing. Nothing personal. Love you. I read it 4 times. I want to be honest with you about what happened in my body because I think you'll recognize it. My jaw didn't drop. My eyes didn't well up. My hand, the one holding the phone, went very still, the way a scale goes still right before it gives you a number you don't want. Nothing personal. I've read a lot of financial disclosures in my life. I know what buried language looks like. Nothing personal is what you write when something is so personal. It would burn the paper if you said it plainly. If you've ever gotten a message like that, technically kind, structurally devastating, I want you to drop a comment right now and tell me the exact words they used on you. I'll read every one. I paid for the cake I never cut. I paid for 5 place settings that stayed folded. I tipped well because none of this was the waiter's fault, and because my grandmother raised me to believe that how you treat people who owe you, nothing tells you who you are. Then I drove home in silence, because I didn't trust my own voice enough to put the radio on and sing along to something stupid. Something normal. Something that belonged to a version of my life where my family showed up. Here's what you need to understand about my family, because it's the whole architecture of what happened next. My mother, Patricia, is 60, retired school administrator. Spent 30 years managing a building full of other people's children with more patience than she's ever shown her own. She doesn't do conflict. She does managed peace. Which is a phrase I made up somewhere around age 26, watching her smile through Thanksgiving dinners that should have ended in someone leaving the table. Managed peace means nobody raises their voice, and nobody ever tells the truth. My stepfather, Gerald, everyone calls him Jerry, is 63. Property maintenance contractor. Big laugh, firm handshake. The kind of man who remembers the name of your dry cleaner and asks after your car before he asks about you. Charming in the specific way that makes you feel guilty, forever doubting him. He married my mother when I was 11, moved into our house with 2 toolboxes and a used pickup truck, and within a year had somehow become the person everyone deferred to at holidays, the one who carved the turkey and told the stories and got the biggest laugh. He has never once, in 22 years, asked me a single question about my job that wasn't really about something else. Usually, something about the trust, phrased casually, dropped into conversation like a coin into a slot machine, to see what would come out. My sister Lauren is 36, marketing director. Successful in the loud, visible way that gets applauded at family dinners, the promotions, the vacations, the professionally lit photos. She's not cruel. She's just never had to be brave. Because nobody ever asked her to be. Lauren has spent her whole life being the daughter people point to, and I've spent mine being the daughter people call when something needs fixing quietly, off to the side, where no one has to watch it happen. And then there's me, the quiet one. The one who went into accounting, instead of something people could picture at a party. The one who, 6 years ago, inherited the responsibility of managing the Carter family trust. After my grandmother Evelyn passed, because I was the only one who understood a balance sheet, and the only one willing to sit in a lawyer's office for 4 hours without complaining. I remember the day Rebecca Hayes, my grandmother's estate attorney, slid the binder across the conference table toward me instead of my mother, and I remember the flicker of something on my mother's face that I mistook, back then for pride. I understand, now it was relief. Relief that someone else would carry it. I never told anyone that being chosen for the job didn't feel like an honor. It felt like being handed the family's spine and told to stand up straight for everyone else while nobody checked whether I could still stand on my own. Here's the arithmetic nobody in my family ever bothered to do. So I did it for them, sitting alone in that restaurant with a cooling piece of cake and a candle I never lit. I had spent 6 years reconciling ledgers for a family that could not spend 20 minutes reconciling my existence. I had authorized distributions for Lauren's wedding, the venue deposit, the flowers, the string quartet she'd insisted on. For Jerry's equipment upgrades, invoice after invoice that I signed off on, because I trusted the man my mother had married. For my mother's roof repair after the storm 2 winters ago, approved within 48 hours, because I didn't want her sleeping under a tarp a single extra night. Every check I processed on time, every audit clean, every late night spent making sure nobody in this family ever had to think about money, because I was the one thinking about it for them, quietly, invisibly. The way you think about your own pulse. Necessary, constant, and completely unnoticed until it stops. And on the one night of the year that was supposed to be mine, they collectively decided I was the thing that could be postponed. I'm not going to pretend I didn't cry a little in the car. I did. Quiet. The kind of crying where you keep your face still and just let it leak out, foot steady on the gas, because pulling over felt like giving the moment more power than it deserved. I passed the turn for my mother's street without meaning to look, and caught myself wondering, with a kind of detached curiosity that scared me a little, whether the lights were on inside. Whether there was laughter happening in a house I'd been quietly uninvited from. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, something else had started underneath the hurt. Something colder. Something with better posture. I didn't go to bed. I sat down at my kitchen table, still in my birthday dress, the heels kicked off somewhere by the front door, and I opened my laptop, because when I don't know what to feel, I know how to work. The house was quiet in the particular way a house gets at midnight when you live alone. The refrigerator humming, a car passing outside, the small tick of the radiator settling. I pulled up the trust files, not because I suspected anything yet, just because reviewing numbers has always been the one place. My hands stopped shaking. I made tea I didn't drink. It sat beside the laptop going cold, a thin skin forming on the surface, while I scrolled. That's when I saw it. A clause I'd skimmed past a dozen times in 6 years. Tucked into page 14 of my grandmother's original trust documents. The kind of legal language you read once and file away as boilerplate. The kind of sentence your eyes slide over the way they slide over a stop sign. You've passed every day for a decade. The trustee shall retain sole discretionary authority to suspend distributions in the event that beneficiary conduct is determined, in the trustee's reasonable judgment, to act contrary to the long-term preservation and purpose of the trust. I read it 3 times, the same way I'd read my mother's text 3 times, except this time, the stillness in my hands meant something completely different. Sole discretionary authority, mine. I sat there at my kitchen table. At 11 o'clock at night, birthday candles still packed in a paper bag on the counter. and I felt something shift that I can only describe as the moment a room goes quiet. Right before you understand, you're not the guest anymore. You're the one holding the door. My hands went still on the keyboard. Not shaking. Still. The way still water sits right before it's disturbed. I read the clause a fourth time, out loud this time, just to hear how the words sounded in my own voice, instead of my grandmother's careful legal hand. Sole discretionary authority. Evelyn Carter had written those words into a document years before I understood what a trust even was. And somehow, without either of us knowing it, she'd left me a door that nobody else in this family even knew existed. If you've ever realized all at once that you weren't a daughter or a sister in someone's eyes, that you were infrastructure, load-bearing and invisible, useful, right up until the moment you asked to be seen, tell me in the comments. I think more of you know this feeling than you'd admit out loud. I didn't sleep that night. I kept scrolling through the Traz transaction history, something I'd done 100 times before on autopilot, half checking boxes instead of really looking. But this time I was looking the way you look at a stranger's face when you suspect you've met them before, hunting for the detail that will finally tell you why. I went back 3 years, then 5. My eyes had gone dry from staring at the screen, and somewhere around 1 a.m. I switched from scrolling to actually reading, line by line, invoice by invoice, the way I should have been reading all along, instead of trusting the summary totals. My accountant's instincts had let slide. 3 line items caught my eye near the bottom of Jerry's most recent maintenance invoice batch. A vendor I didn't recognize, Coastal Ridge Property Solutions, LLC, a name with no history in any of my prior filings, a dollar amount that didn't match any work order I remembered approving. For repairs on a property I wasn't even sure the trust still owned. I pulled up the deed records. It checked out. The property existed. The invoice existed. What didn't exist, as far as I could find in 20 minutes of increasingly focused searching, was a single trace of the vendor doing business anywhere outside these 3 invoices. My pulse was doing something strange by then. Not racing, exactly, but deepening. The way it does, right before you step onto ice, you're not sure will hold. I closed the laptop at 2 a.m. Not because I was tired, but because I understood, with the calm, flat certainty of someone closing a ledger at the end of a long quarter, that tomorrow, I wasn't going to be grieving a missed birthday anymore. Tomorrow, I was going to start an audit. I sat in the dark for a while after that. The laptop screen gone black, just listening to the refrigerator hum and the quiet tick of the radiator, and I noticed something odd. The ache in my chest from the empty restaurant table hadn't gone away, but it had changed shape. It wasn't soft anymore. It had edges. For 6 years, I had been the family's ledger keeper, the quiet hand that made sure everyone else's life ran smoothly, and in exchange I had been handed a text message that said, "We need space." On the one night a year I let myself expect otherwise. I thought about Lauren's wedding flowers, the string quartet, all of it stamped with my signature. I thought about Jerry's easy laugh at the head of the table on holidays he hadn't earned the right to sit at. I thought about my mother's careful, practiced peace, built on top of things she'd never once asked me to explain. And I thought about my grandmother, who had never trusted peace that wasn't backed up by something real, who had built a clause into her trust 20 years ago, as though she somehow knew that one day the family she loved would need to be protected from itself. If you've ever spent years being the one who holds everything together, only to find out you were the only one who ever noticed you were doing it, stay with me for the next part of this story. Because tomorrow, I stopped being the person waiting at the table. For the first time in longer than I could remember. I wasn't waiting for my family to make room for me at theirs. I was deciding whether they'd earned a seat at mine. I called in sick to my own life the next morning. Not officially. I still answered emails. Still logged into the firm's portal at 9 sharp, because habits like that don't break, just because your world tilts sideways overnight. But somewhere behind my eyes, a different version of me had already clocked into a different job. I made coffee I didn't taste. I remember the smell of it more than the flavor, dark and bitter, filling the kitchen while I stood at the counter, still in yesterday's cardigan, staring at the paper bag of unlit birthday candles. I hadn't thrown away yet. I don't know why I kept them. Maybe some part of me wanted evidence, too. proof that the night had happened exactly the way I remembered it, in case anyone ever tried to tell me otherwise. By 9:30, I was back at the kitchen table, laptop open, the trust portal glowing in that clinical blue-white that always reminds me of hospital hallways. I pulled every maintenance invoice. Jerry had submitted going back 4 years, then 5. Then, because something in my gut told me to, all the way back to the year. He first got listed as an approved vendor for trust-owned properties, 86 invoices. I printed every single one, because paper doesn't lag or crash or auto-save over itself, and because I wanted to be able to spread them across my dining table like a woman. Laying out a hand of cards she already suspected was rigged. If you've ever had to quietly investigate someone who calls you sweetheart at Christmas dinner, you already know how strange that particular kind of dread feels. Drop a comment if you've been there. I promise you're not the only one. The dining table disappeared under paper by noon. I organized by property first, then by date, then. Once a pattern started tapping at the back of my skull like a moth against a window, by vendor name. That was when Coastal Ridge Property Solutions, LLC started showing up more than I expected. 14 invoices over 3 years, all routed through Jerry's maintenance contracts, all for a vineyard-adjacent rental property the trust had acquired when I was 26. I called Rebecca Hayes at 11 that morning. She'd been my grandmother's estate attorney for almost 2 decades. A woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back so severely. It looked like punctuation, and a voice that never once, in all the years I'd known her, rose above a calm, measured register, no matter what she was telling you. Her office always smelled faintly of old paper and peppermint tea, a smell I associated so strongly with safety that just hearing her voice on the phone made my shoulders drop half an inch. "Olivia," she said, picking up on the second ring. "It's not often you call before noon on a Tuesday. I need to ask you something about the trust," I said. Hypothetically. There was a pause on the line, the kind that told me she already knew. Hypothetically meant nothing of the sort. Go ahead. If a trustee discovered irregularities in vendor payments, invoices that don't match any verifiable business, what's the actual scope of what I'm allowed to do? Not what I should do, what I'm allowed to do. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear her flipping something, maybe a legal pad. The scratch of a pen being uncapped, the small clink of a mug set down on a desk. Under your grandmother's trust document, as sole trustee, you have full discretionary authority to suspend distributions, initiate a forensic audit, and restrict vendor payments pending investigation. You don't need anyone's permission, Olivia. You never did. I sat with that sentence longer than I meant to. My thumb pressed hard against the edge of the kitchen table. 6 years of quietly asking myself whether I had the right to push back on anything, and the answer had been sitting in a filing cabinet the whole time, notarized and waiting. "There's something else," Rebecca said, her voice dropping the careful neutrality for something closer to concern. "Your grandmother added an unusual level of protection to this trust in her final revision, more than most clients ever request." At the time I assumed it was standard caution. Looking back, I wonder if she saw something the rest of us didn't. I didn't answer right away. Outside my kitchen window, a delivery truck idled at the curb, its engine a low, patient hum, and I watched it for a second longer than I needed to, letting the silence stretch. "Send me the original documents," I finally said. "All of them, every revision. I want to see exactly what she was protecting this family from." If you're new here, this is the part of the story where most people expect the shouting to start. It didn't. Not yet. The next 3 weeks of my life were quiet in a way that felt almost violent. Quiet, the way a held breath is quiet. Quiet the way a house is quiet in the second before a smoke alarm goes off. I kept showing up to family dinners like nothing had shifted. That's the part nobody tells you about this kind of investigation. You don't get to disappear into it. You still have to sit across from your mother, while she talks about her garden club, still have to nod along, while Jerry tells the same story about the flooded basement on Milford Street. He's told 40 times, all while doing arithmetic in your head that none of them know is running. That Sunday, at my mother's dining table, Jerry told the Milford Street story again. The flooded basement, the emergency plumber, the nightmare of coordinating repairs on short notice. He told it with his fork in one hand, gesturing. his laugh filling the room, the way it always did, my mother nodding along like she'd heard a good sermon. I sat there cutting my chicken into smaller and smaller pieces, watching the pattern of his hands, the specific ease with which a lie could sit at a dinner table and be mistaken for charm. Lauren laughed at the right moment. She always did. I used to envy how easily laughter came to her. That night, for the first time, it just looked like something being spent carelessly. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I passed the potatoes when they were supposed to be passed. And underneath all of it, a second version of me sat at that same table, doing long division on $210,000, carrying the remainder silently into the next course. Here's the arithmetic I want you to sit with for a second, because I sat with it for weeks. Every distribution I had ever approved for this family, I had approved without asking a single follow-up question, because trust, actual, uncomplicated trust, was the only currency I'd ever had to offer them, since apparently affection wasn't going to be offered back in equal measure. Lauren's wedding, $41,000, approved in 9 days. My mother's roof, $18,000, approved in 2. Jerry's equipment upgrades, submitted quarterly like clockwork, totaling, once I actually added the real number instead of skimming the summary line, just over $210,000 across 3 years. $210,000 for maintenance on properties that, according to public records, I pulled from 3 different county assessor websites over the course of one long Saturday, hadn't required work anywhere close to that scale. If you've ever done the math on how much you've given a family member without ever once being asked to explain yourself, and then realized the math didn't add up on their end, comment the number. I want to know how many of you are sitting on your own version of $210,000. I started keeping a second laptop for the investigation, one that never touched my work network, because old habits from 6 years of clean audits don't just protect other people's money. They protect you too, when you're the one about to become the story. I drove out to the Milford Street property myself, on a Wednesday afternoon, telling no one, parking half a block down where my car wouldn't be recognized from the driveway. I sat there for 20 minutes with a legal pad on my lap, cataloging what I could see from the street. A roof line that didn't match the full roof replacement, invoice from 14 months earlier, gutters that looked original to the house, a foundation with the same hairline crack I remembered from a property photo taken years before any of Jerry's repairs had supposedly happened. My hands weren't shaking when I wrote it down. They'd stopped shaking somewhere around invoice 41. What replaced the shaking was steadier and colder, something I didn't fully recognize in myself yet, though I would come to know it very well in the weeks ahead. I drove to Coastal Ridge's registered business address. Next, an address that turned out, after 20 minutes of circling the block twice, to be sure, to be a self-storage facility with a rentable mailbox service out front, the kind of place with a chain-link fence and a faded blue sign advertising climate-controlled units. No office, no employees, no sign bearing the company name, just a wall of numbered metal doors, the smell of hot asphalt, and a bored teenager behind a counter who had never heard the company name in his life, scrolling on his phone while a small television behind him played a rerun with the sound off. I sat in my car outside that storage facility for a long time, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, air conditioning fading into the thick afternoon heat, and let myself feel the specific, quiet devastation of confirming. Something you already knew was true. It's different from finding out. Finding out is a shock. Confirming is a door closing gently, one you already had your hand on. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Lauren. I especially didn't tell Jerry, who called me twice that week just to check in, his voice as warm and easy as ever, asking if I'd recovered from my birthday, yet laughing lightly when I said I was fine, so easily believing me, because believing me had always been convenient for him. Rebecca sent the original trust documents on a Thursday, a scanned PDF 40 pages long. My grandmother's handwritten margin notes, preserved in the corners of certain pages, like small private messages, left for exactly this moment. I read every page twice. On page 31, beside the trustee protection clause, in the small, deliberate cursive I remembered from birthday cards she used to write me as a child, My grandmother had written 4 words that I read so many times that week I could still recite them without looking. Protect her from them, not protect the trust, not protect the family. Protect her from them. I sat with that note for a long time. I don't know if my grandmother had proof of anything specific back then, or if she simply understood something about the people surrounding me that I hadn't let myself see clearly yet. Either way, she had built a door into her trust 20 years before I would ever need to walk through it, and left the key with the one person she trusted enough to use it wisely. If you've ever found out that someone who loved you saw a danger coming before you did, and quietly built you a way out, just in case, I want you to sit with that feeling for a second before you scroll away. It's a strange kind of grief, realizing protection arrived before you even knew you'd need it. By the end of that 3rd week, I had a folder, not a metaphor, an actual physical accordion folder, tabbed and labeled the way I label everything, sitting on the passenger seat of my car like a quiet passenger of its own. 86 invoices. 3 years of Coastal Ridge payments totaling just over $140,000. County assessor printouts, their margins already softening from how many times I'd handled them. Photographs I'd taken myself from public sidewalks, time-stamped, dated, organized by property and by date, arranged in the same meticulous order I once used for quarterly trust reports. Nobody in my family had ever asked to see. A forensic accountant's number saved in my phone under a name that wasn't his, just in case someone ever went looking through my call history for answers before I was ready to give them. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't sent an angry text, hadn't done a single thing that would have given Jerry or my mother or Lauren any reason to suspect the ground beneath them had already started to shift. I still answered Jerry's calls with the same easy warmth he'd trained me to offer him. Since I was 11 years old, I still let my mother believe. Her birthday message had landed softly, that space was all I needed, that I was fine. That was the part I understood now, sitting at my kitchen table with a folder of evidence and a grandmother's 4-word note tucked inside the front cover, like a compass. The confrontation wasn't going to come from me raising my voice. It was going to come from a freeze notice, delivered through Rebecca's office, on official letterhead, the same quiet procedural language this family had always used to hurt me, without ever once looking me in the eye while they did it. If they wanted managed peace, I thought, closing the folder and setting it gently on the seat beside me, like something sacred. I was about to give them the most peaceful, most devastating silence of their lives. The call came on a Thursday, 4 weeks after my birthday, while I was standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store I'd been going to since college. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, a cart half full of the same predictable groceries I bought every week because routine had become the only thing that felt steady lately. My phone buzzed against my hip, and I saw my mother's name on the screen. And for one embarrassing second, something in my chest still lifted at the sight of it. Old habits die slower than the people who taught them to you. Livy, she said, her voice bright in that specific, over-cheerful register she used when she wanted something, the same register I remembered from childhood, right before she'd ask me to babysit Lauren. On a Friday night, I'd had other plans for. I need you to release the quarterly distribution early this time. Jerry's got a big equipment order due, and Lauren's floating us some numbers for a new kitchen. Can you push it through by Monday? No mention of my birthday. No apology. No soft acknowledgement that 4 weeks earlier she'd sent me a text telling me the family needed space from me. Just a request, delivered the same easy way you'd ask someone to grab milk on their way home, because to her, that's exactly what I was. An errand. A convenience. A line item that occasionally needed reminding of its job. I stood there in front of a wall of cereal boxes. Cartoon mascots, grinning at me from every shelf, a toddler somewhere down the aisle crying about a flavor. His mother wouldn't buy him, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still. I'll look into it, I said, and I meant some things entirely different by those 4 words than she understood. If you've ever had someone ask you for something in the exact same breath they hurt you, without so much as a flicker of self-awareness, comment below. I want to know how many of you have had to say, I'll look into it through gritted teeth while your whole nervous system screamed something else. I didn't buy the cereal. I left the cart in the middle of the aisle, which is not a thing I do, because I am the kind of person who returns carts to the corral even when it's raining, and I drove straight home with my hands tight on the wheel the entire way. I sat in my driveway for a full minute before going inside. Engine off, watching a neighbor walk her dog under the streetlight, the ordinary rhythm of an evening that had nothing to do with mine. My phone buzzed twice more before I made it to the front door. My mother again. Then Lauren, a text this time. Mom said you're handling the distribution. Thank you. 2 exclamation points, breezy and light, as though the request wasn't sitting on top of a birthday that had never once been acknowledged. I didn't answer either of them that night. I made dinner. I didn't taste. The same way I hadn't tasted my coffee that morning, weeks earlier. And somewhere between clearing the plate and rinsing it, I understood that something in me had finally stopped off waiting for an apology that clearly wasn't coming. I want to tell you about the exact moment the arithmetic finished. Because it wasn't the birthday was the crack. This was the moment the whole structure gave way. I sat down that night with the accordion folder open, on my kitchen table, the same folder that had grown thicker every week for a month, and instead of reviewing invoices, I made a different kind of list. On one side of a legal pad, I wrote down every dollar amount I had personally authorized for this family in 6 years as trustee. On the other side, I wrote down every moment I could remember any of them showing up for me, genuinely, unconditionally, without an agenda folded quietly inside the gesture. The first column filled 2 pages. Dates, amounts, running totals, my own handwriting, growing, smaller and more precise as the numbers climbed, the way it always does when I'm trying to keep control of something that scares me. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the numbers blurred slightly at the edges of my vision, and still the column kept going. Entry after entry, 6 years condensed into a column of ink that told a story I'd never let myself read in full before that night. The second column had 4 entries. 4 in 6 years. A card from my mother the year I passed my CPA exam, which she'd signed. But Lauren had clearly picked out and mailed the handwriting on the envelope unmistakably my sister's. A dinner Lauren had taken me to after a breakup. Though she'd spent most of it talking about her own promotion, checking her phone twice under the table, when she thought I wasn't looking. A voicemail from Jerry, congratulating me on a work anniversary. I'd mentioned once, in passing 8 months earlier, which felt less like affection and more like a man keeping a ledger of his own, tracking which strings to pull, and when, cataloging small kindnesses the way he cataloged invoices, as investments rather than gifts. I stared at those 2 columns for a long time, the kitchen clock ticking somewhere behind me, the refrigerator humming its same low, patient note. Somewhere in that stillness, I stopped waiting for the second column to grow. That's the arithmetic moment. Not fury, not tears, just a woman at a kitchen table finally closing the account she'd been running at a loss for years, and understanding, clearly and without drama, that no future deposit was coming. If you've ever made that list, the column of what you gave, and the column of what you got, and felt the floor drop out from under you, when you saw the difference in ink, I need you to know you're not alone in this. Keep watching. It gets better from here. I stopped looking for validation somewhere around 11 p.m. that night. And I started calculating instead. And the shift between those 2 states felt less like a decision, and more like a physical sensation, like a held breath finally released. Validation had always required them. Calculation only required me. I opened my laptop and pulled up the trust's full distribution history one more time, except this time I wasn't looking for fraud. I was looking for myself. I searched every line item across 6 years for my own name, my own needs, any distribution I had ever requested for my own benefit. There weren't any, not one. In 6 years of managing $11 million in family assets, I had never once approved a discretionary distribution for myself. Not for the down payment I'd quietly saved for on my own, working weekends and skipping vacations, while I watched Lauren fly to Cabo twice in 1 year. Not for the dental work I'd put on a payment plan 2 years ago, rather than dip into trust funds I had access to. Not for anything. I had treated my own needs as beneath the dignity of the ledger. I managed for everyone else, as though asking for anything for myself would somehow compromise the integrity of a system I'd built my entire identity around protecting. I sat with that fact. The way you sit with a bruise you didn't know was there until someone presses on it, testing the edges of it slowly, almost curious about how deep it went. Somewhere in that hour, sitting alone at my kitchen table with cold tea and a legal pad covered in 2 unequal columns, I understood something with total clarity for the first time in my adult life. I had spent 6 years being the family's infrastructure, the wiring behind the walls. The thing that makes the lights turn on without anyone having to think about how. Nobody thanks the wiring. Nobody invites the wiring to dinner. Nobody sends the wiring a text about needing space, because the wiring was never considered a person capable of needing anything in the first place. Wiring doesn't get birthdays. Wiring just gets maintained quietly until it stops working, and then someone calls a professional to figure out what went wrong. If you've ever realized you were the thing holding the house together instead of a person living inside it, tell me. I think this is the loneliest realization a capable person can have, and I think almost nobody talks about it honestly. My hands were steady when I opened Rebecca's number the next morning, steadier than they'd been in weeks. I remember noticing that specifically. The absence of the tremor I'd carried since the restaurant, replaced by something with better posture, the way I'd described it to myself weeks earlier, without fully understanding what it would eventually cost me to become. I made coffee before the call, actually drank it this time, tasted every bit of it standing at the same counter, where a month ago I'd stared at unlit birthday candles. I want to move forward, I told her, once she picked up, formally. I want a forensic audit initiated, and I want to know exactly what my authority looks like if I suspend distributions effective immediately. You understand what this means, Rebecca said, not as a warning, but as a simple confirmation of terrain, the way a surveyor tells you where the property line actually falls. Once you freeze the account, there's no quiet version of this left. They'll know something changed. I know, I said. Your mother will call you, possibly your sister. Jerry will likely threaten legal action before he threatens anything else, because that's the language he understands best. I know, I said again, and I meant it more each time I said it, the words settling into something closer to certainty. With each repetition, there was a pause on the line. And then Rebecca said something I've thought about many times since. Your grandmother built this protection into the trust because she trusted you to use it wisely, not because she trusted you to use it painlessly. Those are different things, Olivia. Don't confuse them. How long until the freeze can actually go into effect? I asked. Once I give the word. Same day, if you want it that way. I can have the notice drafted and sent by end of business tomorrow. But I want you to sit with the decision overnight first, not because I doubt you, because everyone deserves one more night before a decision like this becomes permanent. I almost laughed, actually, a short, humorless sound that surprised me. I've had 6 years of nights to sit with it, Rebecca. Then one more won't hurt, she said gently, and I understood she wasn't trying to slow me down so much as make sure that when Monday came, I wouldn't be acting from the raw, unfinished place I'd been living in since my birthday. She wanted me steady. I appreciated that more than I let on. I didn't cry when we hung up. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a breaking point to look like tears, like a woman collapsing onto a kitchen floor somewhere. Mine looked like the opposite. My jaw tightened, my shoulders squared, and I sat up straighter in my chair than I had in weeks. The posture of someone finally done, asking permission to take up space at her own table. If you've ever noticed your own body change shape, the moment you stopped negotiating with people who never planned on meeting you halfway. Comment below. I think it happens to more of us than we admit, and I think it deserves to be said out loud. I drove to my mother's house that Saturday, not to confront her, not yet, but because I needed to see the house one more time, the way it existed before everything changed. The porch light. Jerry always left on even in daylight, out of some habit. Nobody questioned. The garden. My mother tended every spring with more patience than she'd ever shown her daughters. Rows of tulips. She deadheaded with more tenderness than she'd ever offered me. The driveway where I used to wait as a teenager for rides that came late, or didn't come at all. Standing on the curb with my backpack, while the streetlights buzzed on around me. I sat in my car across the street for 10 minutes, engine off, watching lamplight move behind the curtains, shadows crossing a life that had never quite made room for mine. I could see the outline of my mother moving through the kitchen, could imagine, with an ease that surprised me, exactly what she was doing. Wiping down the counter, checking the oven, living a version of a Saturday evening that had no idea. It was being watched from the outside by the daughter, who'd quietly kept its foundation from collapsing for 6 years. I thought about Evelyn's 4 words again. Protect her from them. And I understood, finally, sitting there in the cooling evening air, that my grandmother hadn't been protecting the money. She'd been protecting the version of me capable of walking away from people who only valued what I could give them. I started the engine and drove home without going inside. There would be time for that conversation, but it wasn't going to happen on their terms, in their kitchen, wearing the version of myself that had shown up quietly for 6 years, hoping someone would eventually notice. The next version of me was going to show up with a folder, an attorney, and a freeze notice. And for the first time since that empty restaurant table, I felt something that wasn't grief. If you've ever driven past the house that raised you and realized you no longer recognized yourself as someone who belonged there, stay with me. Because Monday morning, I stopped being the daughter who kept everyone else's world running. I picked up my phone that night, sitting in my own driveway with the engine still ticking as it cooled, and opened a new message to Rebecca and typed 4 words of my own. Send the freeze notice. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. And I sat there in the dark of my own car, feeling the quiet, seismic click of a door finally closing behind me, and another one, somewhere ahead, just beginning to open. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that too, because triumph isn't really what a breaking point feels like. It felt more like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for so long that my arms had forgotten what it meant to hang naturally at my sides. My shoulders ached that night, in a way I hadn't noticed until the weight was finally gone. Monday morning, the freeze would go through. Monday morning, the phone calls would start, and Monday morning, for the first time, in longer than I could remember, I was going to let them ring exactly as long as I wanted them to, before I decided whether to pick up at all. The freeze notice went out Monday morning at 9:03 a.m., sent from Rebecca's office on letterhead so formal. It looked almost gentle, the kind of document that could end a family without ever raising its voice. I pictured it landing in 3 separate inboxes at almost exactly the same moment, a quiet detonation. None of them would see coming until it was already sitting in their laps. My phone started ringing at 9:47. I let it go to voicemail, then again at 9:52. By 10:15, I had 6 missed calls from my mother, 3 from Lauren, and 1 from a number I didn't recognize that turned out, when I finally checked the voicemail 2 hours later, to be Jerry, calling from a client's landline, because he'd apparently left his own phone in his truck in his hurry to reach me. His voicemail was 40 seconds long, and I could hear traffic behind him, the specific tightness in his voice that told me the easy charm had already started slipping before he'd even finished dialing. I want you to imagine the specific kind of silence that exists in your own house while your phone lights up over and over on the counter, buzzing against the granite with a sound that used to make my stomach drop, and now just felt like weather. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. I actually drank this time, watching the screen light up and go dark, and felt something in my chest that I can only describe as quiet. Not cold, just quiet, the way a room feels after a storm has finally passed through it. If you've ever sat perfectly still while your phone rang itself into exhaustion, knowing exactly why and choosing not to answer anyway, comment below. I think that kind of stillness is its own quiet act of courage. I finally called my mother back at noon, not because I owed her an explanation on her timeline, but because I wanted to hear, in real time, exactly what kind of story she'd already built for herself. "Olivia, what is going on?" she said, skipping hello entirely. Her voice pitched somewhere between panic and accusation. Rebecca's office sent something about a freeze. Jerry's beside himself. "What did you do?" Notice the phrasing. Not what happened. What did you do? As though a forensic audit initiates itself, as though a shell vendor invents its own paper trail, as though I was the disruption in a system that had been running perfectly fine before I opened my mouth. I initiated an audit, I said, keeping my voice level, the way I'd practiced saying it in my head for 3 weeks. As trustee, I have the authority to do that when I find irregularities in vendor payments. Irregularities, she repeated, like the word itself was an insult. Olivia, Jerry has been doing maintenance on those properties for years. What irregularities? A vendor called Coastal Ridge Property Solutions has received over $140,000 from the trust in the last 3 years, I said, keeping my sentences short and factual, the way I'd have delivered a finding to any client, because I understood, even then, that emotion would only give her something to argue with instead of something to actually look at. It's registered to a self-storage mailbox. There's no business address, no employees, no verifiable work history anywhere. I have photographs of the properties that don't match the invoices. I have county records that don't match the invoices. I'm not disrupting anything, Mom. I'm just finally reading what's actually been in front of me the entire time. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost its earlier edge, replaced by something smaller and more uncertain, a tone I didn't remember ever hearing from her before. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "Are you sure it's that bad?" "I'm sure," I said. I wouldn't have frozen it otherwise. The meeting happened 9 days later, in a conference room at Rebecca's office, the kind of room with a long table and a view of a parking lot, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly more exhausted than they actually were. Someone had set out a pitcher of water and a stack of paper cups that nobody touched. My mother sat on one side, Jerry beside her, his jaw set in a way I'd never seen before, the easy charm gone from his face entirely, replaced by something tighter and more careful, his hands flat on the table as though bracing against something. Lauren sat a little apart from both of them, closer to me than I expected, which has surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that day. Rebecca sat at the head of the table with a forensic accountant named Daniel Okafor beside her, a quiet, precise man in wire-rimmed glasses who had spent 2 weeks going through everything I'd handed him and had come back with a report, thick enough to require its own binder clip, tabs color-coded by property, every page numbered in the corner in small, careful print. "We'll start with the numbers," Rebecca said, sliding copies across the table, the paper making a soft, unified rustle as it reached each person in turn. Daniel walked through it methodically, the way I imagine a surgeon walks a patient through an X-ray. Calm, factual, no drama in the delivery, because the facts didn't need any help being devastating. Coastal Ridge Property Solutions, LLC, registered 18 months after Jerry became an approved maintenance vendor for the trust. No employees on record, no verifiable subcontractors. A registered agent address that traced back to a private mailbox rental at a self-storage facility. 11 miles from the nearest trust-owned property, $143,600 paid out across 3 years for work that county permit records showed had never been filed, for materials that 3 separate hardware suppliers had no purchase history, for under either Jerry's name or the property addresses in question. If you've ever watched someone's carefully built version of themselves come apart across a conference table, one piece of paper at a time, you understand the strange quiet of a moment like that. Nobody shouted. Nobody cried yet. There was just the sound of pages turning and a man's breathing getting shorter with every sheet. "This is insane," Jerry said finally, his voice louder than the room wanted to hold. "I've done work on those properties for years. You can't just—" "Then explain the invoices," Rebecca said, calm as ever. "Explain the vendor. Explain the permits that were never filed for work you billed as major structural repairs." Jerry's hand, resting flat on the table, curled slowly into a fist and then released over and over a small tell I don't think he even knew he was doing. His jaw tightened. He looked at my mother instead of at me, as though she might be able to argue the numbers into a different shape through sheer loyalty alone. She didn't say anything. I watched something in her face shift slowly, the way ice shifts before it finally cracks all the way through. Not a sudden collapse, just a long, quiet redistribution of weight until the whole surface gives. Here's the part nobody prepares you for. The breaking point isn't actually the moment the truth comes out. It's the moment right after, when you watch the people who hurt you finally understand what you already knew, and you realize the knowing doesn't undo 6 years of being unseen. It just confirms you were right to stop waiting. Jerry, my mother said quietly, and it was the first time in the entire meeting. Her voice had dropped below its careful managed register. Tell me this isn't true. He didn't answer. That silence told her more than any invoice ever could. I watched my mother's hands, folded tightly on the table in front of her, and I thought about all the years she'd chosen, managed peace over hard truths, all the Thanksgiving dinners where she'd smiled through things. She must have half suspected all the times she'd asked me to smooth something over, rather than look directly at what needed fixing. I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief. It was closer to relief. The specific relief of finally not being the only person in the room who could see clearly. Lauren spoke up next, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Olivia, I'm sorry, I should have asked more questions. I never wanted to be the one who caused problems. I know, I said, and I meant it without bitterness, because I understood, sitting there, that Lauren's silence and my invisibility had grown from the same soil, just watered differently. She'd learned that ease was safer than asking questions. I'd learned that being useful was safer than asking to be seen. Neither of us had built those habits alone. Rebecca laid out the path forward with the same steady calm she'd used through the entire meeting. Jerry would be formally removed from all trustee-adjacent responsibilities, effective immediately. The trust's legal counsel would pursue recovery of the misappropriated funds, and depending on what the full forensic accounting ultimately confirmed, criminal referral remained on the table. My mother, notably, was not implicated in the fraud itself, only in the years of not asking the questions that might have caught it sooner. If you've ever sat in a room and watched consequences finally land on someone who spent years avoiding them and felt strangely calm, instead of vindicated, I want you to know that calm is not the same as not caring. Sometimes it's what caring looks like after you've run out of anger to spend. I didn't get the family I'd been picturing at that empty restaurant table 5 weeks earlier. I want to be honest about that, because I think too many of these stories end with a bow tied too neatly. And mine didn't tie that way. My mother called me 2 weeks after the meeting, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, and told me she was sorry. Not just for the birthday, but for years of choosing peace that had cost me more than either of us had ever said out loud. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase 6 years of being background infrastructure in my own family's life. But it was real, and it was the first time she'd ever named what she'd actually been avoiding. Instead of simply avoiding it again, Jerry never called. I didn't expect him to. Some people only ever loved you for what you made possible for them, and once that stopped, there was nothing left to say. Lauren and I have talked more in the 2 months since that meeting than we did in the 2 years before it. She asked me, for the first time in either of our adult lives, what my job was actually like. Not what it paid. What it was like. I didn't expect how much that small question would matter to me. I restructured the trust, with Rebecca's help, over the following month. Added an independent oversight review. Built-in transparency requirements. No one in this family would ever again be able to quietly sidestep. I did it, not out of anger, but because my grandmother had spent her final years protecting a family that didn't yet know it needed protecting. And I wanted the next version of this trust to make that kind of protection permanent instead of personal. So it never again depended on one exhausted woman staying vigilant alone. I didn't get an apology that undid the loneliness. I got something steadier instead. If you've ever done the hard, quiet work of protecting something you loved, only to realize the real victory wasn't punishing anyone. It was finally being seen clearly for the first time in your life. I want you to sit with that feeling for a second, because it's rare, and it's real. And it's worth everything it costs to get there. On my next birthday, I booked a table for one, on purpose this time, at the same restaurant, the same private room, the same chair at the head of the table. I'd chosen months earlier for a family that never arrived, I told the host I only needed one setting. She didn't blink, just smiled and led me to the seat, with the best view of the window. The one I'd originally picked for my mother. I lit the candle myself this time. I watched the small flame hold steady in the still air of the room. No draft to worry it. No empty chairs pulling my attention toward the door every few minutes. I ate the whole slice of cake, slowly, tasting every bit of the vanilla, without checking my phone once. Rebecca texted me the next morning, a short message that just said, "Proud of you." And Lauren sent a photo of a cake she'd apparently attempted to bake herself, lopsided and a little burnt at one edge, with the caption, "Next year I'm doing this in person, I promise." My mother called that evening, and for the first time in longer than I could remember. The call wasn't about a distribution or a request. She just asked how my day had been and waited for the whole answer. Nobody showed up to interrupt the dinner itself. For the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt less like being abandoned and more like finally being free.